Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum, Sat Sri Akal, Namaste. My name is Farheen Khan and you're watching the Azeeza Show. So over the last several weeks we've talked about a number of different topics. This week we're talking about mental health, and with me today are Ambreen Youssef and Shelby Daigle. Thank you so much for being here today. Mental health is always a difficult topic to talk about, but it's something that's very necessary. So I kind of want to just jump right into it. So can you tell me, what's the prevalence of mental health, in Canada? Are there any specific statistics that we can that you can share with us about the issue of mental health?
Yeah, so mental health, it's reported that 1 in 5 Canadians in any given year experience a mental health issue or an addiction. There's the suicide rates have been rising worldwide. In Canada, it's reported that nearly 3,000 to 4,000 people die of suicide per year. Within a clinical setting, we see more issues of anxiety and depression, which are also increasing. So it's definitely an issue that's, it's becoming very prevalent as people are getting to know what it is, and people are seeking out help and more now. Yeah.
Also, I think what's interesting is, so every year Statistics Canada actually compiles rates related to mental illness. And again, I don't think that off the top of my head, but the actual cost of mental illness, particularly to the workforce. So what we do know in the Canadian context is a lot of people lose time off work because of mental illness, or they're less productive because of mental illness.
Right.
Another thing that's interesting is that although definitely, for example, suicide is a leading cause of death, unfortunately, amongst young people, the actual highest rates of suicide are for people who are middle-aged, so people in their 40s and 50s. Okay. And that's often not talked about. So there's often a focus on young people, which is important, but there's not a recognition that a lot's actually happening when you're middle-aged. Actually, the parents of young people might themselves be going through a mental health crisis that could potentially be what's related to what's happening for the young people that we're seeing.
Right. No, that's interesting to note as well, right? Like the middle-aged piece there. Now, one of the things also that I think that's really important is that we actually talk about what is actually mental illness, right? Let's define it a little bit so that people actually are aware of that.
Well, the basic, most simple definition is that any issue that affects your mind, your heart, and how you act. So your thinking, your feelings, and how you act. And it has to do with emotional well-being, and that's basically what it is. And it kind of trickles down to social well-being as well. So that's the basic definition for it. Shelby?
I think that's a good definition for mental health in general. But I think for mental illness, diagnosis becomes important because it's important for treatment. And a reality is that sometimes you can actually self-diagnose, which you shouldn't do, just like for anything. Yeah. Also, the reality is particularly what happens for younger people, because when you start showing signs, like I was diagnosed with depression at 15. But you change. Like your brain changes. So the truth is your illness could change too. So sometimes your diagnosis might change. Right. So if we think about official diagnoses that are common, so depressive disorder is a common diagnosis, but that actually isn't just one thing. So you can have a depressive episode, which actually ends up being sort of one contained moment. And again, you can find online there's certain criteria for meeting that. Whereas my illness is something which is called dysthymia, which is like an older term for it, but it actually is a chronic depression. So it's actually a low mood that could last for years. It's not just an episode. Now, so particularly my condition, I can end up having something called double depression, where I have my chronic low mood, and then I actually have a major depressive episode on top of it. Right. So that's the nature of that. And depression is a mood disorder. So there's actually 2 types of mental illnesses that we might end up talking about. There's mood disorders. So depression, anxiety disorder, but there's also something called personality disorders. And they are often, I think, in many ways, the least understood, and yet are very important, particularly one, borderline personality disorder is incredibly important in terms of particularly issues around suicide attempts, and is definitely a concern in terms of frequent visits to emergency rooms. And so part of the problem is that oftentimes we are raising awareness about mental illness, but we're actually not raising awareness about the complexity of mental illness.
Right.
And so again, so it ranges from depression, which I would argue is in some ways people are more familiar with, or they think they're familiar with, because everyone's like, well, I felt sad.
Yeah.
It's like, well, actually, it's much more complicated than that, and it might not manifest itself as being sad. In some cases, it can manifest itself as being very irritable or very angry. They have anxiety disorders, which again, as she put, are very more commonly diagnosed.
Right.
But that also can manifest itself in a range of things. So, for example, agoraphobia, which people might have heard of, is people being maybe afraid of going outside. That's actually a form. It's a type of anxiety disorder. But another disorder that's actually much more prevalent than we realize is schizophrenia, which unfortunately, because of our language, people think means multiple personality disorder or having multiple personalities. That's not what it means at all. Right? It is often a breakdown of reality in some ways. It's probably an easier saying, but it's very common. And if you look at this, it's quite common. And it's something that is it common in any community, any ethnocultural community, any religious community. And in some ways, I would argue it's probably the most stigmatized mental illness in our country. And unfortunately, we often see that sometimes being mixed up with issues of criminalization. So if we think about the recent case of Suleiman Fakiri, who died while in custody. Unfortunately, that's not a unique case. There's already been investigation by the provincial ombudsman into the deaths of people with mental illness in prisons in Ontario. So both in terms of prisons, and also there's been investigations in terms of police interaction. So I come from Ottawa, where there was also the case of Abdurrahman Abdi. You'll notice both Muslim names. So I think this is where we realize the full dangers of not fully understanding mental illness, because there's a spectrum of how these disorders might manifest themselves. But in terms of the impact on your life, if you don't get the proper support, if you don't get diagnosed early, if the systems don't know how to support you, can be death.
So, and I appreciate that. So, Ambreen, you work with Nasiha, right, which is a youth helpline. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've sort of seen in terms of people who are accessing service and support?
Yeah, so Nasiha, for those of you who don't know, is a Muslim youth helpline, one of its kind in North America. And we basically are an anonymous and confidential service where we do target the youth, but we get calls from like all types of ages and people and various backgrounds, even non-Muslims as well. And you do see different types of calls, whether it's drugs, addictions, parent-child conflict, people who are struggling with their relationships, girlfriends, boyfriends. You don't see a lot of like the clinical issues, but you do see suicide ideation and all that kind of stuff. You see parents calling in for my child is having this type of issue, how can I help, what are the resources available to tackle this type of problem. So you do see a lot of different, like a various amount of issues that comes through into the calls, for sure. Abuse and trauma as well.
For sure, that I can imagine. So in terms of like the actual, so I mean, I guess my question is that, we have services available, be it Nasiha or some of the mainstream services that exist, right? But how often are people actually accessing that service? And Shelby, you mentioned earlier that there's a stigma around around some of this mental illness. So what would your experience tell you? It's
actually more serious than that. There aren't a lot of services available.
Okay.
And I think that's as somebody who has been diagnosed with mental illness when I was 15 and have had hospitalizations and have also supported other people, it's a myth that there's a lot of services available. And I think, one of the concerns that I have sometimes is when we make it about the stigma, it's like, okay, but what happens when you do try to go for help and you don't get help? So the reality is that a lot of mental health services are not, that you have to pay for them. So there's a huge economic issue, or there's a waiting list. Or frankly, it's about jumping through hoops. So, I'll tell my own story. So when I was a child, my mother was able to bring me to my family doctor. My family doctor was a very aware woman. And she was able to refer me to the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, which is based in Ottawa, which has, one of the leading centers for child mental health and mental illness. That was when I was a teenager. But when eventually I needed help again as an adult, which of course was like a decade or so later, I brought myself to the emergency, and this was not very long ago, it was about 4 years ago. The person there was like, well, you know, if you overdose, you'll just get brain damage and then just be a burden to taxpayers. That was actually told to me in the emergency room.
Wow.
She did refer me to go to a psychiatrist later, so she sent me back home. And when I did go to the psychiatrist, in the end, he actually said to me, you know, you need a lot of support, you need a caseworker, but it's a 2-year waiting list, so I'm not going to refer you. And then also he asked me if I had insurance. As soon as I didn't, he didn't offer any supports. And then handed me a sheet, which I already had in my house because I'm often contacted to refer people to free counseling services.
Right.
So what eventually ended up happening after I almost ended up evicted, I luckily live in community housing, so I was able to call the social worker. That social worker called something which in Ottawa exists is called the Mobile Crisis Unit,
Right.
which works at
They have it
the
here as well.
hospital,
Yeah.
and they were able to come to my door. But that only happened because she was able to refer me. It wasn't something I could have necessarily easily accessed myself.
Right.
So that's an example, and then eventually through them, I now have a psychiatrist. So again, look at that sort of too. But I was somebody who already, you know, was quite knowledgeable about services. I speak fluent English.
Yes.
You know, I'm assertive enough to avail myself of services. So if already you're in a mental health crisis, you have to jump through a lot of hoops often to get services. And so I think it's important, you know, that a lot of our focus in terms of helping is beyond this breaking the stigma and more on, do we actually have services to support people?
Right.
Are these services accessible
Yes.
based on, you know, for people in crisis? So.
And I agree, and it becomes even more difficult when you're seeking culturally sensitive services,
Absolutely,
right? You have
for
it
sure.
like the mainstream, but then you have people who require specific context or, you know, culturally sensitive help, and that becomes even more difficult. Definitely, for sure.
And definitely, so I run MuslimLink.ca. So it's a website that has directories for about over 10 Muslim cities. And we frequently get requests for psychologists or counselors who can provide culturally specific or language specific services.
Right.
So for example, I live in Ottawa. The third language spoken in Ottawa after French is Arabic. And again, what happened when the Syrians came, there was actually all this money put into hiring mental health service providers for Syrians. But the truth is there had already been all this need for Arabic-speaking mental health service providers. But if you're not a Syrian refugee immediately, you couldn't access them. So it became, it's been really interesting. It's another point too in terms of an issue that we have to address too, is that we might have a lot of great people from our communities going in to become counselors or social workers, but we actually need more people who could be privately accessible. So, because again, oftentimes you'd have to come in, you know, so if somebody's working for a particular agency, you'd have to be referred to that agency and meet its criteria. Whereas often what we also need is people who could just privately, individually take services, but that, you know, that's not easy to get. You have to have a certain level of certification, you might have to have a certain amount of money to start doing that. So those are the kind of things we have to look at in terms of supporting
And it's
our
very
community
costly,
members.
like
Yeah.
she mentioned earlier, like hiring a counselor or seeking out therapy is very costly, and it's not funded by the government, right? So that's a barrier. It's a huge barrier.
Absolutely.
Right? So
Which is why it's important to have
Right.
services, right?
Yeah,
That are free, that are anonymous, that are, you know, that
Yeah.
are quote accessible.
And that's
right?
part of the work that Naseeha is trying to work, like the goal that they have, and hopefully, inshallah, you know, as time progresses, they're able to provide more, you know, resources that are more applicable. Yeah.
But I think right now in terms of the community, because again, you know, lives could be lost any day. So I think it's great to work towards certain things, but at the end of the day, also people need a variety
Right.
of services. And so, you know, although there's certain people who definitely want to go towards Azeeza, I know from my own work, there's a number of people who will never want to call a Muslim helpline. They will not, because there's a lot of, you know, depending on what issue they're dealing with, there's a lot of sometimes concern about how they will be judged by the community or how it will be understood. And even the issues around confidentiality. You can tell people as you're confidential as you want. Our community sometimes is 1 degree of separation. And that's another reality we also have to start thinking about, and even in terms of supporting people who are mental health service providers, be they volunteers or professionals anyway. How are you dealing with confidentiality when, you know, your client is at the wedding that you're going to, right? And so that's also another aspect, which is the training, where we need more training to support both people from the communities who are going into the profession, and then also to train people who might be from other communities about how to support people properly. Because again, definitely from my experience with youth, sometimes people, they get some sort of weird training, but then they apply it in a very strange way. So for example, I remember, and I think this person thought they were being helpful, but it was a young woman who was suicidal, and the person said, well, that's a sin in Islam. You can't do that. She deliberately went to a non-Muslim person to not be told that.
Yeah.
So that's where it becomes really important to be like, what do we even mean by culturally sensitive, right? And so, but definitely this yearning for this sort of culturally sensitive thing. So again, we get requests through Muslim Link by mainstream professionals.
So, sorry, I'm just I apologize. We're gonna take a quick break and then we'll come back. All right, thank you, we'll be back. Okay, welcome back everyone. You're watching the Azeeza Show, and I have with me our guests, Ambreen Youssef and Shelby Daigle. We're talking about the issue of mental health, and Shelby was just telling us about the importance of accessing service, right? Shelby?
Yes, and also the issue of, so we've, through Muslim Link, we often have mainstream service providers, so social workers, counselors, sexual assault support centers reach out to us asking for contact with specific Muslim mental health service providers, often from specific ethnocultural communities who also have a specific subject matter expertise.
Right.
So we get a lot of requests, particularly for people who have subject matter expertise on incest and sexual abuse within families from particular ethnocultural Muslim communities. I remember even one time we specifically got a request for a religious sort of scholar who could give information that would support a woman who was feeling very guilty because she was sexually abused by her father, and she was really religiously believed it was her fault that she had not veiled herself in front of him. So these are the kind of things, and these are all Canadian cases. So these are the kind of things where it's been interesting for us, because that's why now we are in the process of compiling not just a list of mental health services, but actually a list of what we'll call subject matter experts, or people who could, because we're like, sometimes I'm like, I don't know. So now I've had to like go and find out, and sometimes it's been so specific. I mean, recently, like, we need a Harari mental health, professional who speaks Harari, and like, okay, that's like a very specific, Ethiopian ethnocultural group, but it's needed. And so, so it's been interesting doing the research, and now like I've got a number of people willing to be part of it, and it's simply to help both the Muslim community and then also the mainstream community be like, wait a minute, there is somebody who is this community and has this expertise, and I can just call them or email them.
That mental illness, it cuts across every ethno-specific and religious community, right? Like, and any community, no matter what, like different socioeconomic statuses. I mean, just because we're speaking about, the context of our experience as Muslims, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's only to, it's specific to us,
But people need to sometimes find that specific person
for sure.
who has that expertise, and so we're trying to make it easier to do that, inshallah.
Okay, great. So one of the things that, over the break we were kind of, chatting about a little bit was, how do we, let's talk a little bit about what the experience of an individual dealing with a mental illness is. And I think that's really key for people to really understand, what does that mean, in terms of your day-to-day life?
So, I mean, I myself am very publicly open. So I've been publicly open since I was 17 about living with a mental illness, because I was involved in a project where a group of young patients of the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario created an educational video, not just for the public, but actually for mental health service providers about our perspective as patients. And then what I did is I took that video and I showed it all over my high school. Because, and I remember that my logic was, the thoughts in my own head and how, I beat myself up every day. I can handle bullies and people making fun of me, because it's just, seriously, like I can come up with better put downs than they could. But even if I think about how my mental illness has evolved since my teens to now, it's changed, but it's always been there. And I think, and I'm somebody who, I have, I'm on medication, it's been managed, but it's never been over for me. And it's partly the nature of my specific diagnosis. It's partly because also my mental illness is related to certain traumas. Another aspect of mental illness, again, depending on the mental illness you have, that's often not talked about, is how it affects other parts of your functioning. So, for example, cognitive functioning. So there's some research, and definitely it's been my lived experience since I was quite young, that I experience a lot of cognitive impairments related to my depression and anxiety. So I have serious problems with my working memory, which can often, when the illness gets worse, affect my ability to study and to work. So you have some people who can be very highly functioning. There's even some evidence that some people who are deeply depressed are actually workaholics. So this idea that it'll always manifest itself a certain way, it's not the case, because everyone's biochemistry is different, right?
Absolutely.
But I know in my case it becomes quite impossible to work, and so definitely in terms of recently, I realized that I had to leave my job. And this is where things become quite serious, and there's now been more research, and there's even more public education in Canada on mental illness in the workplace, because oftentimes that's where it can be manifesting itself. It can affect productivity and other issues, and people might want to be helpful, but the reality is oftentimes they don't know how to be, and then also the expectation is that it's short term, so that could become a problem. So I know in my case, people were very supportive initially, but there was really this idea that it was something you'd get over like the flu.
Right.
And then eventually became frustration, which of course was very triggering for me, because again, particularly when it comes to suicide ideation, which just means suicidal thinking, what the research has shown is oftentimes some of the thoughts that go around that is feeling that you're a burden to people. So that can happen a lot if you're not pulling your weight in a workplace. And then that starts becoming very clear to you, you're feeling like a burden, that in itself can become quite triggering for your suicidal ideation. And so that happened in my case very seriously. Now already I was dealing with problems because my mother had committed suicide. So I already in that context, because I had a very close relative commit suicide, suicide's actually, there's another relative committing suicide, I'm already kind of set up a bit. And then this regular grief process. So already there was something, a problem there. But that had been going on for a while. And again, it's very interesting because my mother had committed suicide 4 years ago. So there's perception that I should be over it by now. It's like, but it's a suicide. So it's a very complicated state of grief. So part of the issues I've seen in my own experience is that people want to be supportive, but oftentimes their understanding is people can't necessarily handle the long-term aspect. So then it becomes quite frustrating to ask for support. So for me, I definitely initially asked for support, and then I just didn't, because it was too clear that people wanted to help, but they wanted to help and then see me get better and it be done.
Right.
And I felt I couldn't meet that expectation. So eventually just things really got out of control, and I, in July last year, attempted suicide, but was able to kind of prevent myself from going all the way. Really because of my own thought process. It was an interesting moment. I just got really mad. And it's interesting because, again, anger is sometimes seen as a negative force, but definitely in terms of psychology, it could potentially be a protective force. So I was used to being angry at myself. I got really mad at everyone else and realized that if I killed myself, I couldn't support my dad. A lot of the children I work with would be negatively influenced. And if I'm feeling like I need to do this because of this situation, maybe I just need to quit my job, right? Like, which of course, stress of financial, instability, but this isn't working. So when I made the decision to do that, I immediately felt a lot of relief. And so that's where, again, there's already a big mental illness going on, but sometimes you have a situation that makes it just too much. And so again, so some people might be familiar with me because, of the crowdfunding campaign I've posted on LaunchGood, which is an Islamic crowdfunding page, kind of like GoFundMe, which, I got the idea for actually because I had seen an article in a Canadian magazine about women who had basically crowdfunded to support their recovery, because, as we've already said before, mental health service costs, are huge, but also if you have to take time off work, which many people do, it's huge. And there, and if you're recovering from a suicide attempt, you actually need to take time off work. So it was interesting, the response, because the way I wrote it was that it was not only a personal story, but also quite educational about what we know about why people commit suicide. Because there's been official research on it. And so the response, was quite overwhelming. I was able to meet my initial target. I've now set another target, so it's continuing. And, alhamdulillah, I'm very grateful for the support. And I think what's been interesting about the response has been how many people also just came forward as like, I'm going through the same thing. People who I had not even known might be struggling with those issues. And so even for myself, as somebody who often thinks I'm very open and aware of these things, we don't know what's going on in anyone's life. And so we always have to be careful what we assume is happening. And I think, as sort of she said earlier, this is far more prevalent than we might realize. And it crosses all sorts of barriers. And it's also why, again, I feel, as a community, we have an opportunity potentially to rally more government support, because it's something that crosses all party lines as well, right? There's people in all the three major political parties in Ontario right now who even have had lived experience of mental illness. So there's an opportunity to address some of these concerns around the costs, around the need for public education and the need for better supports, I think. And I think in many ways that needs to be the way forward, because we need multifaceted approaches, so we can create some Muslim-specific services, but there has to be something available for everyone.
And you summed it up really well, and I think part of the problem is that there's a misconception that people who struggle with mental health are violent, or experience some type of manic. And the truth is that people could be experiencing thoughts of depression and thoughts of suicide and ideation and all that kind of stuff, and you wouldn't even know. And that's the struggle. And it's people are living very secretive lives, especially in the Muslim community, where nobody really talks about it. And on a daily basis, it becomes very difficult for your daily functioning. You lack productivity at work. It may be very difficult for your worship, right? And depression is something where washing the dishes is very difficult task.
Washing yourself becomes
Washing yourself, depression is like it's on a daily basis. Getting out of bed is a huge thing, right? So people don't understand at the level that it actually affects people on a daily basis. And you will find people who are depressed and struggling from suicide and all that kind of stuff that are functioning on a daily basis, where they're just like, they don't look like they're sad. But when you dig a little bit deeper, they have those issues and problems that, and it's very, very, very common. And within the Muslim community, you'll see that from like in a historical, people do live with depression for years and years and years, and they don't seek help. One, because they don't think they have it, or they're ready to admit that, I'm depressed. And you'll see that a lot in our South Asian community. I've seen where parents are just like, no, and then the kids have inherited it, right? And it's a biological thing, and a lot of things are obviously based on like our environment, whether you're just coming out of Syria and you're experiencing PTSD, or whether you've experienced some type of trauma and abuse.
But or whether you're dealing with the more recent issues of like Islamophobia,
exactly,
being othered, right?
Yeah.
But it's also important to point out, and I think this is where, like, in terms of other people I've supported and worked with, in my case, it's very easier for me to point to what my origins are, my origin story. But you have other people who've had completely fine, wonderful lives with wonderful parents.
And they're still dealing with it.
And they're still dealing with it, because at the end of the day, it's your brain.
Yeah.
And, and what we do know about the research, and even when, they've been able to do a scan and compare it to, a normal brain and your brain, you're like, whoa.
Chemical changes,
And I find that's often sometimes really important, particularly for explaining it to people who really think it's just in your head.
For sure.
And you're just lazy. It's like, no, your brain looks completely different.
Of course.
And that's incredibly important too, because I do think part of the issue that I would see is I think for definitely newcomer communities, whatever generation it is, because of sometimes perception of how much hardship people in the past have gone through. And I think that's true for any community. Like, even just if you think of your parents leaving their country and coming here, that's huge. Like, I mean, that in itself is trauma, and it's traumatic. And for a while, actually, one of the hospitals in Ottawa actually had a triage unit in the emergency focused on mental health and migration
Really?
trauma.
No, you know,
And it has nothing to do with war. Just like you've left everything,
right.
right? And you've left who you are.
Absolutely.
But I think the problem that ends up happening is there's a lot of shame involved or even guilt involved in being like, well, we have all these things. Why are you not happy? And I think that...
No,
Yes.
and I wish I had more time to talk about this, because this is something that I think we need to have like an ongoing discussion about. But we've run out of time, so thank you so much for both of you for being here. To the audience, as you've heard, as you've seen, mental illness is something that a lot of us deal with, and it's something that we need to be more mindful of in our lives and the lives of those around us. So until next week, we'll see you then. Take care.